Today I'm going to talk about the book of Genesis and the genre of mythology in its real sense. Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. In modern times, mythology is extremely misunderstood, and I'm going to get to why in a second. But the false understanding of mythology is essentially, well, it's basically a false explanation or a false history. It's kind of what people tend to think of mythology as, like, oh, that's a myth, means that's not true. That's not what the genre of mythology is at all. The genre of mythology is a genre wherein you communicate complex and difficult truths in a way that is graspable in some reasonable amount of time. And you have to use narrative to do that because that's basically what's actually graspable by most people and in a reasonable amount of time, because narrative is in fact the structure of reality. Now, why is it we misunderstand this so much? Well, it's because the modern world is, and I use modern kind of in the capital M, like modern philosophy sense, the sort of thing that was born with Descartes asking, in his famous work, Meditations on First Philosophy is actually the second one, but the one I remember better, with his famous cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. He asked the question in this, and he posed this, of can we know anything at all? Is there any knowledge that we have? And so that's kicked off the modern world with a capital M. And he answered the question, yes, of course. He proved the existence of God and then showed how God wouldn't let us be completely deceived, etc., and so on. And the conclusions of Meditations on First Philosophy is essentially like, yeah, and so you can see that like all of this was actually just sort of a ridiculous exercise because I'm kind of back to where I started, but at least I have shown a clear foundation for it. What Descartes' actual meaning is a separate topic. The point is, large numbers of people didn't believe him, and so more or less everyone else in the modern philosophy answered, no, you can't, and then elaborated on that in ways that don't make any sense. And it worked its way out as people showed how the previous answers don't make sense and gave new answers, yada yada, till you get to the final last stab at this, which was Kant, and then Nietzsche drove a stake into it, giving us the postmodern, that was the end of the modern world into the postmodern world, when Nietzsche showed, like, no, that doesn't work. Well, the thing is, sort of what was bequeathed to us in the modern world, because we're still a weird hybrid of modern and postmodern in these senses, is a focus on verifiability, a focus on the ability to verify something. Because part of what came about, more or less, it was the scientific method, which in fact did not come about here, but the scientific method as a thing that you might actually stick inside of quotes, came about more or less because people were preoccupied with the concept of being deceived in absolutely everything. And so this seemed to show a way in which you could at least provably be not deceived about something. It wasn't very much. Like, if you actually look at like what is actually amenable to the scientific method as it is described, the answer is not actually nearly as much as people think. Works pretty well for like physics and chemistry, and that's mostly it, really, actually. Aspects of biology, especially when it becomes biochemistry, and of course biology works just fine as like butterfly collecting. But yeah, it doesn't like how much of life is like when I throw something with a certain amount of force, I know how far away from me it will land. How much of reality does that sort of thing describe? And the answer is not very much. In that like direct sense. So it was a retrenchment. It was very much a retrenchment from trying to know the world to, well, there are a few things I can know, I think. Well, maybe not know, but at least I can predict in a sort of reliable-ish way, as long as I focus on like the things that I can measure. That attitude, focusing on the things that you can measure, leads to the modern narrative. Modern narratives are all pretty much, and it's because of this thing about what you can measure, they are all an attempt to transport somebody through time and space, to transport the experience of having been someplace to the person who's reading. So whether you're talking about fiction or nonfiction, in narratives, the general modern goal, the modern goal of modern narratives, is to describe for you what you'd have seen, heard, smelled, touched, tasted, etc., had you been there. And for how long would you have seen, smelled, touched, etc., each of these things, and in what sequence, and so on. Because and this belies the modern fixation on this sort of verifiability. That you don't trust anything, and so the goal is to represent as much as possible just the barest things that would have been verifiable to you had you been there, that you can then sort of make of them whatever you will. Plus, and as I said, this is both fiction and nonfiction. If you look at modern novels, they consist of that sort of thing. They consist of telling you this sort of narrative of what you've seen, heard, etc. Although sometimes they will have a narrator, and a narrator might even let you in on somebody's thoughts. Broadens out a little bit, but not very much. In nonfiction, this really, really, really becomes the modern narrative. Probably the most, both history and newspapers sort of strive, or in theory strive, to have that sort of form. That they, in theory, more than in practice frequently, are an attempt to simply tell to you the things that you might have seen had you been there at the time. Again, in theory. But because this is the modern narrative structure, now there are a few other narrative structures people do realize, like fables, for example, fables, parables, etc. People are aware that these things exist in a modern context, but they don't tell them for the most part. You do not find people in the modern context telling fables. You don't find them telling parables. It doesn't really come up very often. It's not a thing that modern people really instinctively do. And so a problem comes up when modern people, look at the book of Genesis, and, well, like, obviously there are things about this that are factually wrong. Like, had you been there, this is not what you would have seen. Very clearly. You can tell that in a number of ways. And I'll get to that in a little bit. But then this poses a problem. Well, this is defective. Because in a modern narrative, if any of the things you could have measured, experienced, really, but empirically verified, are inaccurate to what you would have actually empirically experienced had you been there, then the modern narrative is defective. And so they see this and think like, well, the book of Genesis is defective. And a lot of atheists stop right there. And then what happens essentially is then people try to explain to them, well, no, this is not a modern narrative. This is mythology. It's a different genre. It's not trying to do that at all. So, like, if particular details are inaccurate in that sense, it's irrelevant to the actual truths that it is trying to convey. But modern people will see this and think like, oh, come on. There is no other genre. There's only one genre, the modern narrative genre. And so you're just inventing this excuse. You're trying to invent some other thing when only one type of narrative exists. And so obviously you're only doing that because it turned out to be false and you're trying to cling to it anyway. That's not at all what's happening. It's just that there's more than one genre. And in fact, that modern genre is fairly new. And it has to do with our modern preoccupations, especially our modern preoccupations with empirical verifiability, that we have essentially modern, modern myth, to use it in the modern sense, that there's actually very much in the world that's empirically verifiable. Now, I want to go through a few minor things here. Or I want to go through a few examples to build up what myth actually is as a genre. So, I want to start with a fable. Fable is not mythology. There's a very important difference between the two, which I'll get to, but it's a great starting point. And I promise I will be brief, at least brief for me. Consider one of Aesop's most famous fables, The Boy Who Cried Wolf. Now, in a modern narrative, you would do things like describe the boy who cried wolf. You'd say where he was. But here's the thing. As you're going through this as a fable, imagine, okay, there once was a boy who lived in a village. Well, what was his name? Doesn't matter. What was the name of the village? Doesn't matter. How tall was the boy? Doesn't matter. What color were his eyes? Well, it's Greek, so probably brown, but doesn't matter. What was his hair? Curly, straight? Well, Greek, so probably curly, but it doesn't matter. Again, in a modern narrative, you would tend to describe some of these things so you had things to visualize, and you had details that would also serve to prove that the narrator knew what he was talking about that could be checked against other things. all the better things that he could only have known if he was there, this helps to lend veracity. That's not at all the point. And so, as you keep on going through, you can keep on looking at none of these details matter. Now, the standard telling of Aesop's fables also tends to not include them, but suppose there's a picture. Well, the thing about a picture is it forces you to make a whole bunch of choices. How tall he was, whether his hair was curly or straight, how long his hair was, what his eye color was, and so on. So if an artist paints an illustration, he's going to have to make a lot of these choices. He's going to pick something, because you can't draw all hair lengths. You can't draw all hair types. You can't draw all hair colors. You have to pick one. So what's going to happen if you have an illustration is that you have to pick some of these details, but everyone knows it doesn't matter. Had he actually had straight hair, doesn't change a thing about the nature of the story. And what's the story? The story, it has, a simple moral to it, because the thing is a fable, it's not mythology. And the simple moral to the story is that if you lie to people often enough, they're going to stop believing you. And then when you tell them the truth, they still won't believe you. Okay, very true about the structure of reality. But it doesn't really matter whether or not this ever happened. I mean, there may well have been a boy who cried wolf. This could be, for all we know in the modern world, a true story. There could have, been some kid who actually literally did this, and people then later told the story because, hey, illustrates the principle really well. But it doesn't matter in the slightest. It doesn't matter one iota whether or not there was in fact such a boy or not. We don't care about the boy. We don't care about his village. We don't care about his sheep, and we don't care about the wolf. They don't matter. All that matters is the moral of the story. That's what makes this a fable. Now, it clearly is a genre wherein the details are irrelevant. The facts of the case are irrelevant. All that matters is the structure of reality represented to it. Okay, so that's the fable. Mythology differs from a fable in that mythology is communicating truths, complex, deep truths that are hard to simply describe. And especially hard for most people to receive through an abstract description about a specific thing. So, this, by the way, is one of the reasons, as a detail, why the creation myth for religion that you see quite often among atheists, that religion is just bad science. People didn't know how the weather worked, and so they invented gods of the weather in order to explain the weather as primitive meteorology, is just so wrong, is because myths don't have to be correct, by the way. The mere fact that it's trying to convey a truth does not, in fact, mean that it's right. It's detail. It can be, however, conveying a truth. Now, the problem that they do is they utterly miss what the myths are about. The myths are not about the mechanism of how lightning or thunder happens. The myths are about things like how you relate to lightning and thunder. What is the significance of lightning and thunder, etc. When we're not talking about like silly things like the sort of thing where like you might joke that the thunder is Thor fighting the giants. In the same way that, like, apparently there's a thing in the South that some people say that rain is the devil beating his wife. And like, no one actually thinks that. That's just kind of a funny thing to say. It's a funny image. People sometimes even mistake those for mythology. But there are definitely myths about things, and those myths are there to explain a truth. So I want to go through a very modern myth that most Americans, at least, will be familiar with, and I think it's reasonably well known outside of that, too. And that is the founding myth of the United States that you will see in Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. So if you look at the very beginning of it, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Okay, so is this factually accurate? No, not at all. Not at all. If you go back, scores 20 years. So if you go back 7 years ago, or 87 years beforehand, did their fathers? No, it wasn't their fathers at that point. 87 years later, this was not their fathers. It was an older relative. But of course, they didn't mean fathers in that way. I'll get to that part. Doesn't matter in a moment. It wasn't their fathers. The nation was not conceived in liberty. Even if you stretch that a little bit, I mean, it obviously was not conceived in any sort of literal sense. And even if you take if you're not quite that literal about it, the nation being conceived in liberty is conceived in war, really. And it was conceived, if anything, not really liberty, but the overthrow of a tyranny. and consisted of the establishing not really of liberty, but of a government. So, I mean, even fairly metaphorical readings, this is not literally true. If you look at what were they doing, no, they weren't really, it wasn't really conceived in liberty in any particularly literal sense of the thing. Liberty was not as such a goal. They wanted to overthrow the tyranny that they were under. They wanted to establish a government to secure, amongst other things, liberty. But to say it was conceived in liberty is not factually accurate, even on metaphorical readings of this. Dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal? No. Not in, again, it was not dedicated to anything, really, not in a very literal sense. And even again, in a more metaphorical reading, was it dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal? I mean, when it had the 3/5 compromise, where slaves counted as 3/5 of a person, right in there? No, it wasn't. Okay, so it is not, it does not pass muster. As a modern narrative, this is not what happened. If you were there and looking at this, that's not what went on. Factually inaccurate. Any way you want, even on more, looser readings of the words, it's still factually inaccurate. But here's the thing. Does that mean that this description of the founding of the United States was wrong? No, it doesn't. Because here's the thing. What was Lincoln doing? Lincoln was trying to describe, why is it that currently the Civil War, the American Civil War, was going on? Why was the North not letting the South out of the Union? Why was the North fighting this bloody, terrible war in order to keep this going? Why was slavery such a big deal that the North was, if not, again, it's a really complicated history, and the North was not explicitly fighting to end slavery in like a super direct sense, but on the other hand, it was slavery that was the driving issue that made the Southern states leave and form the Confederacy, or think that they left and think that they formed the Confederacy, depending upon how you want to read that. And so the thing is, this explanation is true. If you look at it, why did this happen? Well, here's the thing. The country was not, in a literal sense, conceived in liberty, but the concept of liberty was something you cannot separate out from the founding of the United States. And the dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Again, it wasn't, in a literal sense, dedicated to that, but in a different sense, it was one of the founding principles. And I mean, in one sense you can see this in the non-binding document, the Declaration of Independence, where it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among those are the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Yeah, but I mean, that wasn't constitutive. It wasn't the Constitution. That wasn't constitutive of the government. It was just a declaration that what was not, in fact, the United States at the time made. Now, the thing is, you can see that in there, and moreover, the Constitution does, for example, forbid the granting of titles of nobility, which is very interesting and very unusual for the time. And so in this, you can see that there was something about the United States that meant that this Civil War really was inevitable. It could not, in fact, be avoided. And this is highly relevant to Lincoln because a lot of people did kind of blame him for starting this war. They thought this war, with better statesmanship, could have been avoided. And Lincoln is making the point that really it could not have been. If you look at the nature of the United States, this was inevitable. This, in some sense, had to happen. Now, obviously, the South could have said, like, okay, no more slaves, gotten rid of slavery, and it would, in the Civil War, would not have happened, because they wouldn't have wanted to secede, because the reason they seceded was because of slavery due to the nature of the balances and so on at the time. Without, again, getting into the detailed history of the United States, there was, in a very real sense, something about the nature of the United States that made the Civil War inevitable, and something that Lincoln could not have avoided through better statesmanship, and something that needed to be fought and needed to be won for the country to continue to exist in any real sense. No, I don't, by the way, mean that the United States here is in some way unique. I mean, for example, England got rid of slavery before the United States did, historically speaking. And England is, was and still is a monarchy, if a parliamentary monarchy. And so the point here is that what is going on? What it's using is a factually inaccurate narrative that convey very important truths very succinctly and understandably about a particular thing that actually exists and its actual history. So, this is the genre of mythology. Mythology is using a narrative structure to communicate important truths about a real thing. Now, as I said earlier, the mere fact that something's a myth doesn't mean that that it necessarily is true. A person can make a myth that is false. It is, mythology is the attempt to communicate truths. But the point is that the maker of the myth is attempting to communicate something they actually believe to be true. And why is it in the form of the myth? It's because narrative is unimaginably more compact than is abstract description. The problem with abstract description, if you ever try to actually think it through, and the problem a lot of people come to is they've never done that. They just think that everybody knows what they mean when they say abstract things, and they never bother following up to see what did the other person understand by what I said. And what you'll find if you actually do this, it's an incredibly time-consuming process, and you'll need a lot of patience, and so will the other person. You'll probably drive them crazy. I know certainly I did through all my time of trying to do this, but what you find when you try to communicate things via abstract language is that people don't have the same reference for their abstractions. It's certainly not in fullness. And the abstractions themselves, for the most part, don't tend to clarify the reference to the particular words that are being used and to the ideas that are being used. And so what ends up happening is, if you want to actually successfully communicate by way of abstractions, you have to do what happens in the places where that actually works, like mathematics. And the way you do that is through many, many years of intense study that most people hate and most people won't do. And the few who manage to get through many, many years of this will then finally be able to hold these conversations, and everybody will know what everyone else means there. Because that actually does go on in mathematics. And not in very many other places, actually. Some, and they all have that element of massive amounts of study that most people can't even do. Like, most people would fail a college-level mathematics class. And which is okay, because most people would never, ever sign up for a college-level mathematics class anyway. College is about where you start getting to the really real mathematics and the full sense where people understand what the heck they're talking about. So, the way it goes here is the way it goes everywhere. If you want people to actually understand abstract things, what you need is a decade or two of rigorous study that most people can't do. Now, if that's really what you want to do, and you are fine with limiting your audience to the tiny fraction of people who will go through that decade or two of intense study that most people can't do, then, hey, it works. Good for you. There are problems with that, though, if you should happen to be concerned with, say, the overwhelming majority of humanity. At which point you have to find some other way of communicating these truths in a way they will actually understand and know what you mean. And that's where mythology comes in, because while abstraction is very difficult and requires holding a ton of things in your mind in a very unnatural sort of way that is a learnable skill, but takes a long time to learn and is difficult and requires a certain base level of intelligence that simply is not that common. By intelligence, I mean like raw processing power, the ability to remember things, to recall them quickly, to etc., see connections between things that were not elaborated, etc. Intelligence being very different from wisdom. Wisdom being like, actually understanding the world and being correct about the world. Intelligence just being sort of like raw processing power. The ability to just do lots of calculations, remember lots of facts, etc. Lots of definitions of words, for example. Okay, so there's the thing. If you care about the overwhelming majority of humanity, you need something better than something more effective than abstract communication. If you care about actually succeeding in communicating. As I said, most people don't. Most people just assume everyone knows what they mean, and then most people are misunderstood. But if you phrase things in narratives, because the human mind understands narratives very well, because narrative is actually the fundamental structure of reality. Reality is a narrative. You can somewhat ironically see it right here in Genesis, that God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Or again, in the book of John, ex arche en hologos, ke hologos en proston theon ke theos en hologos. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then it goes on to say, and everything had its being through him, and not one thing had its being except through him, through the logos being word, speech, thought, rationality, logic, argument, etc. That's what the word logos meant in Greek at the time. So to say that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and all things came to be through the logos, is to say that all things are rational, to say that the world was created as a narrative. Now, for any atheists who might be watching, I'm not trying to prove that the world has a narrative structure to you. This is just a convenient way to people who accept the book of Genesis, or people who accept the gospel of according to St. Mark, of seeing this really clearly, really easily. If you're an atheist watching this, life's a lot harder here. Just look around and see how many people understand narratives and how many people understand abstract stuff. Run some basic statistics and notice that 99% of people is way bigger than 1% of people. And there you go. Anyway, whatever reason you want to assign to why people understand narrative better, the truth that that's the fundamental structure of reality, that it is a narrative, or you just want to say that's the way the human mind works, we just understand narratives better, whatever the actual cause, the effect is undeniable. People understand narrative much, much better than they understand abstraction. And so, again, if you care about the majority of humanity, narrative is basically the way you're going to get truths across. Now, there's one other thing, and that is, you'll notice how long I took to say a bunch of stuff. Even about, I elided almost the entirety of American history, and I had so many digressions just to be even slightly accurate on a factual basis. If you wanted to actually tell a narrative in a way that is factually accurate in that modern sense, you will be telling this narrative for a very, very long time. And while human beings understand, almost all human beings understand narrative and understand it, and all human beings understand narrative much better than abstraction, almost none of them have the patience to listen to a 5-year-long lecture. And, a 5-year-long narrative. And so you have to, if you want anyone to understand it, condense. You have to simplify. You have to make this thing short. Look at the length of the creation narrative of America in the Gettysburg Address. It's under 4 sentences. And it's a tiny little paragraph. I think the entire Gettysburg Address is what was it, 87? Oh, shoot. I'm a little tired, and I apologize. I remember, the entire Gettysburg Address is under 200 words. It may even be under 100 words. The creation myth of America that's embedded in it, conveying some of these very important truths about specifically America, is so short it has no time to say anything in a factually accurate way, because it takes an awful lot of facts to make up anything meaningful. And this, by the way, is very similar, in fact, to that old saying that a picture is worth 1,000 words. That if you take a picture, there's so much in it that it would take 1,000 words to do all of the description involved. That if you're talking about the color of the wood grain, the color of the darker parts in the wood grain, and how the wood grain is distributed, and then how big the wood is. I'm using the picture you're looking at the moment, and then go into talking about the various bows that are back here, and then the color of the wall, but the fact that you can see subtle shadings in it, because after all it is textured, because that's the nature of paint over drywall. You're going to be here a very, very long time, but the picture has all of this information in it. Well, in the same sort of way, it takes a lot of facts to make up anything meaningful. And again, if you try it, you'll just guaranteedly fail. So what do? Well, you take all of the facts that don't actually matter to what you're doing, and you don't say them. You kind of, to some degree, will often try to be kind of slightly close-ish, sort of, where it works. but to a great degree, you just elide everything. You take all sorts of different things and you combine them into one thing that isn't very representative of them all. In some more extreme cases, you just straight up fabricate things so that you have a narrative that has the correct structure of reality to it, because what matters is the structure of reality being revealed in the narrative, not the factual details. So it's another video that'll get into what does the Book of Genesis mean, because frankly, that could easily be like, a dozen video series just right there. This video is already longer than most people watch anyway. So so I'm not going to get into the specific meaning of it there. It's also, by the way, something that's fairly easy to go find. You can look up Bible concordances. There are tons of commentaries on the Book of Genesis. But just to give a very simple thing, look at the first creation account. By the way, another way you can tell this is not, the Book of Genesis is not a modern story, is it has two factually contradictory creation accounts right there. The first and the second chapters. You cannot reconcile these things, because in the one, you have you have like the creatures in the sea, and then the creatures of the land, and then human beings who are made male and female, in that order. And in the other one, you have man, then you have all of the animals, and then you have female. There is no way you can possibly reconcile these things factually. They factually disagree with each other. So it cannot possibly be intended as a modern narrative, which is attempting to be factually accurate in that sense. Possibly meaningless, but factually accurate. That's the modern narrative. Modern narrative structure. It can't be that. It simply cannot possibly have been that, because the thing contradicts itself, directly, unambiguously contradicts itself. Now, like some of the important truths, if you look at it, you see things like that God spoke the world into existence. And you see that the world unfolded according to a rational plan, as you see, first God created something essentially created a primal chaos. But the primal chaos didn't predate God. God made the primal chaos. Let there be light. And then eventually God separated out into light for there to be night and day. And then later he actually made like a sun and the moon and so on. And what do you see? You see that the world is being improved upon according to a rational plan. That God is first created the raw material and then is developing the raw material in various ways. And then you see the increasing of the increasing complexity of animals and so on, up to the pinnacle of creation of human beings who then have dominion over all the things that preceded them. All of this stuff is all deeply meaningful about the structure of reality. And as I said, I'm not even scratching the surface. I'm just going over the surface here. I'm kind of going over the surface and just looking down at it, not even scratching the surface of the meaning here. But the point is, all of these things are deeply meaningful. All of these things contradict all sorts of things that people believed, and all of these things teach you some very, very important things about the nature of the world and about how the world was created, what its natural ends are, and things like this. And so, that's the thing. Any one of those things I just said, you can spend hours talking about in abstractions and barely get across the same thing. That just in the words, God said, let there be light, and there was light. The amount you can write on this in abstract language to describe what's going on in those few simple words is just incredible. And if you did that, and you expected anybody to get anything out of it, you would leave almost the entirety of humanity in the dark. Pun not intended. And so that's sort of the thing to understand the Book of Genesis. That's the genre. The genre wherein you are using a narrative structure to convey the important things about life to people who don't have the time and the memory and the native intelligence to go over these things, and by the way, who intrinsically can't, because we're born as young children and need to learn things so that we can act according to the nature of reality for those first 20, 30 years of our life. It wouldn't do you very much good if you were left completely in the dark about the nature of reality to live the first few decades of your life as you did all of the study necessary to finally grasp the the abstract descriptions of it, if you're one of those lucky few who are even capable of grasping the abstract descriptions of it. And so it's not that. It presents things in a way that even children can grasp at least some of, although there's a lot they can't grasp in it, but they can at least start catching hold of some of the truths in the book of Genesis. And the older they get and the more they reflect on it, the more they're capable of understanding, the more these simple narratives that will stick with them, because we remember narratives very well, are going to enlighten their mind as they think about this, as they grow, and as their capacity to understand increases. And so mythology is unbelievably more effective at communicating truths in this sort of way than is abstract communication. That is, so, because in the modern thing we have narratives that simply like relay meaningless facts in the particular way you'd have experienced them at the time, and then we have abstract communication to say what they mean that most people don't understand. And the modern world is really screwed up. Just look at it even a little bit, which will kind of tell you all you need to know about which of these two approaches is actually the better approach. But not to completely poo-poo modernity, the modern narrative structure has its place. It makes for good novels, among other things. And it also, the modern abstraction I dearly love. I'm one of those people who actually spends decades of study looking at abstract stuff. I've got a master's degree in mathematics, too. I love abstraction, actually, but you have to bear in mind I'm a weirdo. And the things like that are not good for most people. Most people don't find them interesting. Most people can't do them. And also, there are lots of things that I learned about the world from being told in narrative structure long before I could ever understand it abstractly, that helped me to live according to it. All sorts of things, including, incidentally, the story of the boy who cried wolf, to sort of bring it back. So that's the thing. The modern world has lost sight of what the purpose of narrative, the power of narrative. But all of the world, from slightly before the modern world to the ancient world, did not lose sight of the power of narrative. It used the power of narrative. And so that's why there exist genres like the genre of mythology that communicates deep truths in an accessible way to people who haven't done decades of study to finally be ready to grasp still only a fraction of it in very difficult study of abstraction. So, when you look at the book of Genesis, that's the genre. It becomes history later on, by the way, because the book of Genesis is a lot of things put together. It's 40 some odd chapters. And as you start getting to Abraham, you start getting to the history of Abraham. But that beginning of Genesis, that's its genre, and that's how you're supposed to read the thing in order to actually get some benefit from it. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.